Good afternoon and welcome back to the Haunted Weekend. We've just been discussing the case of Silverton Abbey near Bedford, which was very dear in cost to the man letting a large haunted house. But he did at least have the advantage that at some cost he could have left this problem behind. That was going on in 1896 and possibly later. In 1897 there came news across the channel of a haunted family, Mr. and Mrs. Saburo, who by 1897 had been haunted by a poltergeist for 20 years. This began when they married, so we have to infer that the agent was Mrs. Saburo, possibly also Mr. Saburo. But by the time that this came into the newspapers, the most clear agent and victim of the poltergeist was their 12-year-old daughter, Renee Saburo. The main manifestation of this poltergeist was hammering, rapping noises, but it also, as we'll see, persecuted Renee Saburo, who was on the whole a very quiet, not at all hysterical or agitated girl. But the family by this stage had been chased around France by this poltergeist, because they simply had no other idea what to do except to flee from it. They were clearly very haunted people, perhaps in some curious quasi-biological sense, given that Renee seemed to have inherited what had been going on before her birth. The father, Mr. Saburo, was in fact a stonemason with a very good job. He would take a contract to build a church, get going, and finally he had to leave it unbuilt and head off somewhere else. So at the time of the newspaper reports, they're in Isère. They've been haunted for 20 years, and interestingly also, it's quite possible that we would never know of this case at all if it were not for a bunch of skeptics. Monsieur Duplotier and his colleagues, as Duplotier is a lawyer, hear of the case and, taking a default sceptical position, come down to the house to see what all this nonsense is about. They're so impressed by the reality of it, with careful observation of the residents for any possible hoaxing, careful lighting and so forth, and there's 4 of them I think in total, that they make a total of 4 visits. On one visit they hear what sounds like someone walking about upstairs. They hear rapping, which will go on the walls, on the floors, and actually some distance above the roof. They hear what sounds like a 4-footed animal pattering about above them. And on the 4th visit, they hear what sounds like a colossal being, creature, who knows what to call it, but something of immense weight, creaking the stairs as it comes down them. Very well heard, although completely invisible. They also start to hear rapping from what sounds to them like a hand of bone, I quote, which seems to be making some degree of communication or response to their questions. So we have here a very typical rapping poltergeist, not typical in the degree of its persistence, and one which is very, very clearly associated with, generated by, attached to, and also persecuting 12-year-old Renee Saburo. We don't know any backstory of the family. It's possible there's some actual psychological trauma that we're not told, but Renee certainly recalls other female poltergeist victims. Her father states very clearly in one report, Renee's face is all swollen up. Whenever that happens, I know there is going to be a shindy. Now we have the case of Esther Cox in Amherst in Nova Scotia in the 1870s, funnily enough going on at exactly the same time that this French case kicks off. And famously in the early stages, Cox, who is traumatized about a secret, probably sexual assault from what we can infer, is sleeping with her sister. They share a bed in the house, and she bursts out of bed in a state of radical trauma and hysteria, incredibly hot, agitated and swollen, almost as though she's going to explode. She looks visibly swollen up and horribly agitated, and in fact she does more or less explode. There's a colossal crash in the house. The mother of the house hurtles around to check that the children are all right, that there isn't actually a storm. There is not. It's a clear night. And fascinatingly, Esther Cox after this feels much better and is able to lie down quite calmly and presently go to sleep. We have also the case of Tina Resch in 1984, Columbus, Ohio, very well witnessed case by William Roll, where the mother and the daughter, the foster mother, and the daughter in this case both complain of headaches at the back of the head or stomach aches just before something blows off. What do we have finally with the Saburo case, where they are chased about and, in fact, towards July 1897, are being suspected of some degree of black magic or witchcraft by their neighbours? We also have Renee complaining that a ghost invisibly is gripping her arm and bearing it a few moments later to show red handprint on her skin. After this, the case, as far as I can find out, I'd love to know if anyone's got more data on it, simply goes cold, but sadly we have no reason not to suspect that it ran on into the next century and chased the Saboros further around France. Many thanks for listening.